The war was over. Everyone knew it. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. The Wehrmacht had surrendered unconditionally to the Allies on May 8, 1945. Across Europe, German soldiers were laying down their arms, walking out of trenches and bunkers with white flags, surrendering to British, American, and Soviet forces. The Third Reich, which Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years, had collapsed after just 12. But in one city, deep in what had been Eastern Germany, the fighting continued. In Breslau, a city of 600,000 civilians and 40,000 soldiers, the Nazi garrison refused to surrender. For 6 more days after Germany's official capitulation, German troops in Breslau continued fighting Soviet forces street by street, building by building, killing and dying for a regime that no longer existed, defending a city that had already been destroyed. This is the story of the siege that outlasted the war itself. January 16, 1945. Karl Hanke stands at the window of his office in Breslau's City Hall, watching columns of refugees stream past in the street below. He is 41 years old, the Gauleiter of Lower Silesia, one of the most powerful Nazi Party officials in Eastern Germany. He has been in this position since 1941, administering the region with the brutal efficiency expected of a true believer in National Socialism. Now, watching the refugees fleeing westward from the advancing Soviet armies, he faces the most important decision of his career. The Red Army is less than 100 miles away. Soviet tank formations are advancing rapidly across Poland, crushing German resistance, moving toward the German heartland. Every city in their path faces the same choice: evacuate or defend. Most are choosing to evacuate. Civilian populations are being moved west to avoid the fighting. Military garrisons are withdrawing to more defensible positions. The eastern provinces of Germany are being abandoned to save the core territory closer to Berlin. But Karl Hanke has different orders. He has received a direct communication from Adolf Hitler, transmitted through Martin Bormann. Breslau is to be held at all costs. The city is to become a fortress, Festung Breslau, a strong point that will tie down Soviet forces and prevent them from advancing toward Berlin. Evacuation of civilians is forbidden. The population must remain to support the defense. Any talk of surrender is treason. Hanke reads the order again, knowing what it means. If Breslau becomes a fortress, the city will be destroyed. There is no possibility of successful defense. The Soviets have overwhelming superiority in numbers, artillery, tanks, and aircraft. They have crushed every German defensive position between Moscow and here. They will crush Breslau too. But the order is clear, and Hanke is a loyal Nazi. He calls a meeting of the city's military and civilian leadership. Present are General Hermann Niehoff, commander of the Breslau garrison, Major General Hans von Alphen, chief of staff, and various party officials and city administrators. Hanke explains the situation. Berlin has ordered Breslau to be defended as a fortress. Civilian evacuation is prohibited. The city must be prepared for siege. General Niehoff objects immediately. He is a professional soldier, a veteran of the Eastern Front, and he understands military reality. Breslau cannot be defended successfully. The city has 40,000 troops, a mix of Wehrmacht regulars, Volkssturm militia, and various support units. Against them, the Soviets can concentrate hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The city's fortifications are obsolete, designed in the 19th century, completely inadequate against modern artillery and tanks. The civilian population of 600,000 will consume resources needed for defense and will suffer catastrophically when the fighting begins. Evacuation is the only rational choice. But Hanke cuts him off. The order comes from the Führer himself. It will be obeyed. There will be no evacuation. There will be no retreat. Breslau will be held. General Niehoff realizes he has no choice. Refusing the order means execution for treason. He begins planning the defense, knowing it is hopeless, knowing that thousands will die for nothing, but following orders because that is what soldiers do. The first step is fortification. Breslau sits on both banks of the Oder River in Silesia, a region that had been part of Germany for centuries. The city is a major industrial and cultural center, home to universities, factories, railways, and a significant population. Its strategic value is minimal. Holding Breslau will not change the outcome of the war, but Hitler has ordered it held, and so it will be held. General Niehoff organizes the civilian population into labor battalions. Men too old for military service, women, teenagers, everyone capable of physical work is conscripted. They are given shovels, picks, and axes. Their assignment is to turn Breslau into a fortress. They dig anti-tank ditches around the city's perimeter, massive excavations 12 feet deep and 20 feet wide. They build concrete bunkers at key intersections. They barricade streets with rubble and wire. They prepare defensive positions in buildings throughout the city. The work continues day and night, through January's bitter cold, as the sound of artillery grows louder in the east. On January 20th, Karl Hanke makes an announcement that seals Breslau's fate. He declares that any civilians attempting to leave the city without authorization will be shot as traitors. The city is now a prison. 600,000 people are trapped inside, forced to remain while Soviet armies approach. Panic spreads. People who had been preparing to flee now realize they are stuck. Food supplies begin to run short as distribution breaks down. The city's infrastructure starts to collapse under the strain of military preparation and population pressure. And still, the refugees keep arriving. People fleeing from villages and towns to the east pour into Breslau, believing the city will be safer than the open countryside. They are wrong. By late January, Breslau's population has swollen to nearly 800,000. The city is overcrowded, undersupplied, and completely surrounded. February 15, 1945. The siege begins. Soviet artillery opens fire on Breslau from positions to the east and south. The bombardment is methodical and devastating. Soviet gunners target the city's infrastructure. Railway stations, power plants, water pumping stations, bridges. They fire incendiary shells into residential districts, starting fires that spread through wooden buildings. They use heavy-caliber guns to demolish fortifications that took weeks to construct. The shelling continues for hours, then days, then weeks. Breslau burns. In the first week of bombardment, entire neighborhoods are reduced to rubble. Thousands of civilians die in their homes, crushed by collapsing buildings or burned alive in fires they cannot escape. The city's fire brigades are overwhelmed. There are too many fires, too few firefighters, too little water. The water mains have been damaged by artillery. What water remains must be rationed for drinking. Buildings burn until they collapse. The ash and smoke hang over the city like a funeral shroud. General Niehoff organizes his defense into concentric rings. The outer ring consists of strong points in the suburbs, fortified buildings and bunkers designed to slow the Soviet advance and force them to fight for every block. The middle ring follows the city's old fortification walls, obsolete structures from the 19th century that still provide some defensive value. The inner ring protects the city center, where the garrison headquarters, supply depots, and remaining civilians are concentrated. Between these rings, every building becomes a potential defensive position. German troops prepare ambush sites, artillery positions, machine gun nests. They lay mines in the streets, booby-trap buildings, create interlocking fields of fire. Breslau is transformed into a killing ground, where every advance will cost the attackers dearly. The Soviet assault begins on February 16th. The Sixth Army under General Vladimir Gluzdovsky attacks from the east. They advance cautiously, having learned from experience that German defenders in urban terrain are dangerous even when outnumbered. Soviet infantry move forward supported by tanks, artillery, and air support. They clear buildings systematically, room by room, floor by floor. German defenders fight from basements and attics, firing then withdrawing to the next prepared position. The battle develops a horrible rhythm. Soviet forces attack, German defenders resist. Both sides suffer casualties. The front line moves forward a few hundred yards. Then the cycle repeats, day after day, week after week. The casualties mount on both sides. Soviet losses are heavy because urban combat favors the defender. Every building must be cleared. Every basement must be searched. Snipers fire from windows. Machine guns are positioned to create crossfires. Mines explode under advancing tanks. German losses are heavy because they are outnumbered and outgunned. For every Soviet soldier killed, replacements arrive. For every Soviet tank destroyed, more are brought up. The Germans have no replacements. Every casualty weakens the defense. Every position lost cannot be retaken. By March, the situation in Breslau is desperate. The outer defensive ring has collapsed. Soviet forces control the suburbs and are fighting their way into the inner city. The civilian population is starving. Food supplies are nearly exhausted. The city is cut off from the outside world. No supplies are coming in. The only connection to German-held territory is by air, and the Luftwaffe can barely maintain even token supply flights. The aircraft that do get through bring ammunition and medical supplies, not food. Civilians are eating anything they can find. Rats, cats, dogs, grass, bark from trees. Thousands are dying of starvation and disease. The hospitals are overwhelmed with wounded soldiers and civilians. Medical supplies have run out. Surgery is performed without anesthesia. Amputations are done with saws meant for cutting wood. The dead are buried in mass graves or simply left in the ruins because there is no one to bury them. Karl Henke, watching his city die, makes one of the most controversial decisions of the entire siege. He orders the construction of an airfield in the city center to allow supply planes better access. The chosen location is the Kaiserstrasse, Breslau's main boulevard, a wide avenue lined with historic buildings. Hanke orders the buildings demolished to create a runway. Thousands of civilians are forced to work on the demolition, tearing down their own city's architectural heritage to create a landing strip that might allow a few more supply flights. The work is done by hand because fuel for machinery is too precious. Women and old men use hammers and crowbars to demolish buildings that took centuries to construct. The rubble is cleared by hand, carried away in baskets and wheelbarrows. The work takes weeks and accomplishes almost nothing. By the time the runway is ready, the Luftwaffe has almost no aircraft left. The few planes that land bring token supplies, nowhere near enough to feed the starving population. The destruction of the Kaiserstrasse becomes a symbol of the siege's futility. Enormous effort expended for no meaningful result. Historic architecture destroyed for temporary military convenience. General Niehoff understands that the defense cannot succeed. He requests permission from Berlin to evacuate civilians or negotiate surrender. Both requests are denied. Hitler, isolated in his bunker in Berlin, still believes that fortress cities can tie down Soviet forces and delay their advance. He orders Breslau to fight to the last man. Hanke enforces the order ruthlessly. He organizes flying courts-martial, military tribunals that travel through the city looking for defeatism. Soldiers who speak of surrender are executed. Civilians who hide food are shot. Anyone who fails to show sufficient enthusiasm for the defense is hanged. The bodies are left hanging in public squares as warnings. Terror becomes a tool of control. Hanke believes that if the population is more afraid of him than of the Soviets, they will continue to resist. But resistance is collapsing. By April, the Soviets control 3/4 of Breslau. The German garrison is compressed into a small area in the city center. Ammunition is running out. Artillery pieces fall silent because there are no shells. Machine guns are used sparingly because bullets must be saved. Hand-to-hand combat becomes common because firearms are useless without ammunition. German soldiers fight with bayonets, shovels, knives, anything they can use as a weapon. They throw rocks from windows. They collapse buildings onto advancing Soviet troops. They die in basements, buried under rubble, too weak from hunger to escape. April 20th, 1945. Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday. In Berlin, the Führer celebrates in his bunker while Soviet shells explode overhead. In Breslau, the defenders receive a message from Berlin. Hitler thanks them for their heroic resistance and orders them to continue fighting. General Niehoff reads the message and does not respond. There is nothing to say. 10 days later, on April 30th, Hitler commits suicide in his Berlin bunker. The news reaches Breslau on May 1st. The war is effectively over. Germany has no leadership. Berlin is about to fall. The Wehrmacht is surrendering across Europe. But in Breslau, Karl Hanke orders the fighting to continue. May 2nd. Soviet forces in Berlin accept the German surrender. The capital has fallen. The government has collapsed. Across Germany, Wehrmacht units are surrendering to Allied forces. In the West, German soldiers march into American and British captivity, grateful to avoid Soviet capture. In the East, German units surrender to Soviet forces, knowing they face uncertain fates, but accepting that the war is over. But in Breslau, the garrison fights on. General Niehoff sends messages to Berlin asking for orders. There is no response. Berlin is occupied. There is no one to give orders. Niehoff is on his own. He considers surrendering, but knows that Hanke will execute him if he tries. Hanke still controls the city through terror. His security forces patrol the ruins, hunting for defeatists, executing anyone who speaks of surrender. May 6th. In Reims, France, General Alfred Jodl signs Germany's unconditional surrender to the Allied powers. The document states that all German military operations will cease at 23:01 hours Central European Time on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe is officially over. When the news reaches Breslau, General Niehoff convenes his officers. The situation is clear. Germany has surrendered. Continuing to fight is meaningless. The garrison must surrender to save the remaining civilians. But Hanke disagrees. He argues that the surrender applies only to Wehrmacht units, not to party organizations or fortress cities. Breslau, as a designated fortress, is outside the normal military command structure. Therefore, Breslau is not required to surrender. The argument is insane, a desperate rationalization by a fanatic unable to accept reality. But Hanke has the power to enforce his interpretation. He threatens to execute any officer who attempts to negotiate surrender. May 8, 1945. At 23:01 hours, the war in Europe officially ends. Across the continent, fighting stops. German soldiers emerge from trenches and bunkers, waving white flags. Allied troops cease firing. Prisoners are taken. The killing stops. But in Breslau, the siege continues. Soviet artillery still fires into the city. German machine guns still fire back. Soldiers on both sides continue to die in street fighting. The battle for Breslau has become disconnected from the larger war. It exists in its own reality, a pocket of violence continuing in a conflict that has ended everywhere else. May 9th. Karl Hanke makes his final decision. He will not surrender, but he will not stay to face the consequences. In the early morning hours, Hanke boards a small aircraft on the makeshift runway on Kaiserstrasse. The plane takes off from the burning city, heading west, leaving behind the population he forced to stay, the soldiers he ordered to fight, the ruins he helped create. Hanke escapes. He lands in territory still held by German forces, changes his identity, and attempts to disappear. He will be captured by Czech partisans 3 weeks later and executed. But on May 9th, as he flies away from Breslau, he abandons the city to its fate. With Hanke gone, General Niehoff finally has the authority to act. He contacts Soviet commanders and proposes surrender negotiations. The Soviets agree. On May 6th, delegations meet under a white flag. General Niehoff, representing the Breslau garrison, and Soviet General Gluzdovsky, representing the Sixth Army, discuss terms. The negotiation is brief. Germany has already surrendered unconditionally. Breslau's surrender will follow the same terms. German troops will lay down their arms. Officers will be taken prisoner. The city will be occupied by Soviet forces. Niehoff accepts. He has no leverage and no alternatives. The agreement is signed. At 1400 hours on May 6, 1945, the siege of Breslau officially ends. German troops begin emerging from defensive positions, weapons grounded, hands raised. Soviet soldiers move forward cautiously, uncertain if the surrender is genuine, ready for treachery. But there is no trick. The Germans are genuinely surrendering. The fighting stops. After 82 days of siege, Breslau falls silent. The statistics of the siege are horrific. German military casualties exceed 29,000, 6,000 killed, 23,000 wounded or missing. Soviet casualties are even higher, approximately 60,000 killed and wounded. Civilian casualties are impossible to calculate precisely. Estimates range from 40,000 to 80,000 dead. Tens of thousands more died during evacuation attempts or in the chaos after the siege. Of Breslau's pre-war population of 600,000, fewer than 200,000 remain in the city when Soviet forces occupy it. The rest are dead, fled, or deported. The city itself is destroyed. 60% of buildings are damaged or demolished. Every bridge is collapsed. The infrastructure of water, electricity, and sanitation no longer functions. Entire neighborhoods have ceased to exist, reduced to fields of rubble indistinguishable from natural terrain. The historic city center, with its medieval churches, Baroque palaces, and 19th-century civic buildings, is gone. What remains is a landscape of destruction that resembles photographs of ancient ruins more than a modern city. Soviet forces occupy Breslau and immediately begin reconstruction under new ownership. The Potsdam Conference in July and August 1945 assigns Silesia to Poland as compensation for territory Poland lost to the Soviet Union. Breslau becomes Wrocław, a Polish city. The remaining German population is expelled. Poles from eastern territories now controlled by the Soviet Union are resettled in Wrocław. The city's identity changes completely. German street names are replaced with Polish names. German monuments are torn down. Polish monuments are erected. The city's German past is systematically erased and replaced with a Polish present. Within a decade, Breslau has disappeared, and Wrocław exists in its place. The question that haunts the siege of Breslau is, why? Why was the city defended when defense was obviously hopeless? Why were civilians prevented from evacuating? Why did the fighting continue for 6 days after Germany's surrender? The answers lie in ideology, organizational dysfunction, and individual fanaticism. Hitler's fortress city strategy was based on the idea that strong points could tie down enemy forces and delay their advance. In theory, if Soviet armies had to stop and besiege cities, their offensive momentum would be lost. In reality, the Soviets simply bypassed fortress cities and continued advancing. Breslau tied down Soviet forces for 82 days, but it did not prevent the Red Army from reaching Berlin. The sacrifice accomplished nothing strategically. The prohibition on civilian evacuation reflected Nazi ideology about total war. Hitler believed that civilians should share the burden of defense. A city with a large civilian population would fight harder because everyone had a stake in the outcome. In reality, the trapped civilians became additional casualties without contributing meaningfully to defense. They consumed food and medical supplies needed by soldiers. They died in bombardments and fires. They starved to death when supplies ran out. Their presence made the siege more horrible, but did not make the defense more effective. The continuation of fighting after Germany's surrender was the result of Karl Hanke's fanaticism and cowardice. Hanke refused to accept reality because acceptance meant admitting that everything he believed was wrong. The Nazi ideology he had devoted his life to had failed. The war was lost. The Reich was destroyed. Rather than face these facts, Hanke insisted that Breslau could somehow continue fighting independently. His decision to flee on May 9th revealed the truth. He knew the cause was hopeless, but he was willing to let others die for it while he escaped. General Niehoff's role is more complicated. He was a professional soldier following orders from a criminal regime. He objected to the defense of Breslau, but carried out the orders anyway because refusing meant execution. After the war, Niehoff spent years in Soviet captivity and was released in 1955. He always maintained that he did his duty as a soldier. Critics argue that duty does not excuse complicity in a hopeless defense that killed tens of thousands. Defenders argue that Niehoff was trapped in an impossible situation where every choice led to disaster. The debate continues. The individual stories from the siege reveal the human cost in ways that statistics cannot. There was Anna Berger, age 62, who survived the entire siege in her apartment basement, living on potatoes and melted snow, emerging on May 7th to find her building collapsed around her. There was Lieutenant Franz Kohler, age 24, who held a defensive position in a ruined factory for 17 days, watching his platoon of 30 men reduced to 4 before they finally ran out of ammunition and surrendered. There was Dr. Wilhelm Schmidt, a surgeon who performed over 300 operations in a makeshift hospital without anesthesia, using instruments sterilized in vodka because there was no proper disinfectant. There was 15-year-old Peter Neumann, conscripted into the Volkssturm in March, given a rifle and 10 bullets, and sent to defend a street corner where he was wounded on his second day and captured by Soviet troops who were shocked to find children fighting. These individual experiences multiplied across tens of thousands of people create the full picture of Breslau's suffering. Every building that collapsed crushed someone. Every fire that burned consumed someone. Every artillery shell that exploded killed or wounded someone. The siege was not an abstract military operation. It was tens of thousands of personal tragedies happening simultaneously, each one destroying lives and families in ways that would never heal. The aftermath of the siege shaped the city's future for generations. The destruction was so complete that reconstruction took decades. Wrocław was rebuilt slowly through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Some historic buildings were reconstructed from photographs and architectural plans. Others were demolished and replaced with Soviet-style apartment blocks. The result is a city with a fractured identity. German architecture next to Polish monuments, next to communist-era concrete. The layers of history sit uneasily together, each one representing a different trauma. The German population expelled from Breslau scattered across Germany and the world. They formed exile communities that maintained memories of the city as it was before the war. They published memoirs and histories. They held reunions. They kept alive the memory of Breslau as a German city. even as the reality of Wrocław as a Polish city became established. The tension between these competing memories lasted for decades. Only in recent years, with most of the siege generation dead, has it become possible to discuss Breslau-Wrocław's history as a shared tragedy, rather than a contested memory. The military legacy of the siege influenced Cold War defensive planning. NATO and Warsaw Pact strategists studied Breslau as an example of urban warfare and siege tactics. The lessons learned shaped thinking about how to defend cities and how to attack them. The conclusion was consistent. Urban combat is extraordinarily costly for both sides, but ultimately the attacker with superior numbers and resources will prevail. Defending cities to the last man accomplishes nothing except maximizing casualties. These lessons influenced military doctrine for decades. Today, Wrocław is a thriving Polish city of 640,000 people, larger than pre-war Breslau. The scars of the siege are mostly erased. The rubble has been cleared. The buildings have been rebuilt. The infrastructure functions. Young people walk streets that were battlefields without knowing what happened there. But evidence of the siege remains for those who know where to look. Buildings still bear bullet holes in their facades. Cellars that served as air raid shelters still exist beneath modern shops. Unexploded ordnance is still occasionally discovered during construction projects. The city's archives contain thousands of photographs documenting the destruction. The memories persist in families whose grandparents survived the siege. The history cannot be completely erased because it shaped everything that followed. The Siege of Breslau stands as one of the war's most pointless battles. It accomplished no military objective. It did not delay the Soviet advance significantly. It did not save lives or protect populations. It simply destroyed a city and killed tens of thousands of people in service of a regime that was already defeated. The defense was ordered by leaders who refused to accept reality. It was enforced by fanatics who valued ideology over human life. It was carried out by soldiers who followed orders even when those orders were criminal. And it was suffered by civilians who had no choice in their fate. The broader context of World War II's end makes Breslau's siege even more tragic. By February 1945, Germany's defeat was inevitable and imminent. The Allied armies were closing in from all directions. The Wehrmacht was exhausted. The economy was collapsing. The population was starving. Continuing the war served no purpose except to accumulate additional casualties. Every day the war continued. Thousands more people died. Every battle fought in the war's final months was pointless because the outcome was already determined. But the war continued because the Nazi leadership refused to surrender. They preferred national suicide to admission of defeat. Breslau was one piece of this larger insanity. Hitler's fortress city strategy demanded that certain cities be held regardless of cost. Breslau was designated as one of these fortresses, and therefore it had to be defended, even though defense accomplished nothing. The decision was made in Berlin by people who would not suffer its consequences. The execution was left to local officials like Hanke, who were ideologically committed to following orders regardless of human cost. And the price was paid by soldiers who died in ruins and civilians who starved in basements. The technical aspects of the siege reveal both the desperation of the defense and the overwhelming power of the offense. The German garrison of 40,000 men was a mixture of regular Wehrmacht units, Volkssturm militia, police, and various support personnel. The regular Wehrmacht units were mostly fragments of divisions that had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times during the retreat from the Soviet Union. They were experienced but exhausted, under strength and under-equipped. The Volkssturm militia consisted of men too old or too young for regular military service, given minimal training and inadequate weapons. Many had been civilian employees or party officials until conscription put them on the front line. The police units were trained for security work, not combat. The support personnel were cooks, clerks, and mechanics pressed into service as infantry because there was no one else. Against this improvised garrison, the Soviets deployed elements of the Sixth Army, a formation that had fought across Poland and into Germany. Soviet forces numbered over 100,000 men, supported by hundreds of tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, and complete air superiority. They had unlimited ammunition, continuous reinforcement, and modern equipment. The disparity in combat power was overwhelming. The only advantage the Germans had was defensive terrain. Urban warfare favors the defender because every building is a potential fortress, every street a potential killing ground. German troops used this advantage skillfully, making the Soviets fight for every block. But skill cannot overcome a 5-to-1 numerical disadvantage indefinitely. The artillery bombardment of Breslau was systematic and devastating. Soviet artillery tactics evolved significantly during the war. Early in the conflict, Soviet artillery was often poorly coordinated and ineffective. By 1945, Soviet gunners were highly skilled at mass fire missions. They would concentrate hundreds of guns on a single target area, firing precisely timed salvos that saturated the target with explosives. Against fortified positions, they used heavy-caliber guns firing armor-piercing shells that could penetrate concrete. Against personnel, they used fragmentation shells that created casualty zones hundreds of yards wide. Against buildings, they used incendiary shells that started fires. The combination was lethal. German defensive positions that might have withstood conventional assault were simply obliterated by artillery before Soviet infantry attacked. The air campaign over Breslau was equally one-sided. The Luftwaffe was virtually non-existent by February 1945. German air power had been destroyed in the battles over Germany against Allied strategic bombers. The few aircraft remaining were needed for homeland defense. Breslau received almost no air support. Soviet air power, in contrast, was massive and effective. Soviet aircraft flew ground attack missions against German positions throughout the siege. They strafed defensive positions with cannon fire. They dropped bombs on strongpoints. They provided reconnaissance information to Soviet artillery. German troops in Breslau operated under constant threat from the air, with no possibility of friendly air support. The logistics of the siege illustrate the impossibility of the defense. A city of 800,000 people requires enormous daily supplies of food, water, medicine, and fuel. The Wehrmacht garrison required ammunition, fuel for vehicles, spare parts, medical supplies, and food for 40,000 men. The total supply requirement was thousands of tons per day. The only supply route was by air, and the Luftwaffe could deliver maybe 50 tons per day when flights were successful. The gap between requirement and availability was unbridgeable. From the moment the siege began, Breslau was slowly starving and running out of ammunition. The only question was how long supplies would last. Civilian suffering during the siege exceeded anything the military endured. Soldiers at least had a role in the fighting, a sense of purpose, however futile. Civilians simply endured. They hid in basements during bombardments. They stood in line for hours for tiny rations. They scavenged for firewood to heat freezing apartments. They watched their children starve. They buried their dead in backyards because the cemeteries were full. They lived in terror of Soviet assault and Nazi reprisals simultaneously. The psychological trauma was immense. Survivors reported nightmares for decades after the war. Many suffered from what we now call PTSD, though the diagnosis did not exist at the time. The medical situation in Breslau collapsed early in the siege. The city's hospitals were overwhelmed in the first weeks. Wounded soldiers and injured civilians filled every bed. Doctors and nurses worked around the clock performing emergency surgery, treating burns, amputating limbs destroyed by artillery. Medical supplies ran out. Anesthesia was exhausted. Surgery was performed on conscious patients who were held down by orderlies while doctors operated. Morphine for pain relief was reserved for the most severe cases. Antibiotics to prevent infection were unavailable. Wounds that should have been treatable became fatal from infection. The mortality rate in hospitals exceeded 50%. Patients who survived surgery often died from post-operative complications that could not be treated. The siege created terrible moral dilemmas. Doctors had to decide which patients to treat when resources were insufficient for everyone. Should they save soldiers who could return to fight, or civilians who had no military value? Should they use limited morphine on dying patients for comfort, or save it for treatable patients in severe pain? Every choice meant someone would suffer or die. There were no good options. Medical personnel made impossible decisions and lived with guilt for the rest of their lives. The breakdown of civil order created opportunities for crime. With police focused on security enforcement and Nazi party discipline, ordinary crime increased. There were reports of looting, black market activity, assault, and even murder as social controls weakened. Food became the most valuable commodity. People with access to food supplies had enormous power. Some used that power to help others. Others exploited it for personal gain. The moral complexity of human behavior under extreme stress was on full display. Some people demonstrated extraordinary courage and generosity. Others revealed cruelty and selfishness. Most tried to survive as best they could, in circumstances no one should have to endure. The role of women during the siege was particularly significant. With most men either fighting or killed, women became responsible for survival. They scavenged for food. They cared for wounded. They protected children. They maintained whatever remained of normal life in basements and ruins. Many women worked on the demolition of the Kaiserstrasse, physically tearing down buildings by hand. Others worked in factories producing ammunition and equipment for the defense. They were nurses, messengers, firefighters, laborers. Their contribution to the city's survival, such as it was, cannot be overstated. Yet their stories are often overlooked in military histories that focus on combat operations. Children suffered trauma that would affect them for life. Young children living through the siege experienced constant fear, hunger, injury, and the death of family members. Many were orphaned. Some were separated from parents in the chaos and never reunited. Those who survived carried psychological scars. Studies of siege survivors decades later showed higher rates of anxiety, depression, and relationship difficulties. The trauma of childhood during the siege influenced their entire lives. Teenagers faced unique dangers. Boys as young as 15 were conscripted into the Volkssturm and sent to fight. They received minimal training, inadequate weapons, and were expected to defend positions against veteran Soviet troops. Many were killed in their first combat. Others were wounded and received inadequate medical care. Teenage girls were put to work in factories or hospitals, performing adult labor under wartime conditions. Both boys and girls faced the additional threat of sexual violence as order broke down and Soviet forces approached. The siege stole their youth and replaced it with horror. The Soviet perspective on the siege is less documented in Western sources, but equally important. For Soviet soldiers, Breslau was one more German city to capture in a war that had devastated their homeland. They had marched from Moscow to Berlin, fighting every step of the way, losing millions of comrades. They had seen German atrocities in the Soviet Union, the burned villages, the murdered civilians, the systematic destruction. Many felt that Germany deserved whatever suffering it received. This attitude influenced Soviet behavior during the siege. Restraint and mercy were rare. Soviet troops saw themselves as delivering justice, not committing crimes. Soviet casualties in the Breslau siege exceeded 60,000 killed and wounded. For Soviet commanders, this was an acceptable price for capturing an important city. Soviet military doctrine accepted heavy casualties as the cost of victory. Soviet society, having lost over 20 million people in the war, had become numb to death on a massive scale. Individual lives mattered less than the collective victory. This calculus, horrifying from a Western perspective, was the reality of Soviet warfare. Soviet soldiers were expected to die in large numbers if necessary to achieve objectives. Breslau's capture cost 60,000 Soviet lives, but it was accomplished, and from the Soviet perspective, the cost was acceptable. The comparison between Breslau and other besieged cities of World War II is instructive. Leningrad endured a siege of 872 days and lost over 1 million people. Stalingrad was fought over for 5 months and destroyed completely. Berlin was besieged for 2 weeks and suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties. Budapest was besieged for 50 days. Warsaw was systematically destroyed. Breslau's 82-day siege and 40,000 civilian deaths, while horrific, were not the worst urban battle of the war. But Breslau was unique in one respect. It continued fighting after Germany's surrender, making the final week's casualties completely pointless, even by the standards of a pointless war. The legal questions raised by the siege remain debated. Were the Nazi officials who ordered the defense guilty of war crimes? Karl Hanke certainly was, but he was executed by Czech partisans before any trial. General Niehoff was held criminally responsible by Soviet authorities and imprisoned, but many German veterans believed he was simply following orders. The broader question of when following orders becomes criminal complicity has never been satisfactorily resolved. The Nuremberg trials established that following illegal orders is not a defense, but the practical application of this principle remains contested. The rebuilding of Wrocław represented an attempt to create a new identity for a traumatized city. The communist Polish government invested heavily in reconstruction, partly for practical reasons and partly for ideological purposes. A rebuilt Wrocław would demonstrate the success of socialism. A Polish Wrocław would erase the German past and justify Poland's territorial gains. The reconstruction was impressive in scale, but complex in meaning. Every rebuilt church was simultaneously a restoration of cultural heritage and an erasure of German history. Every new apartment block housed Polish families in a city that had been German for centuries. The layers of meaning in Wrocław's architecture tell stories of conquest, displacement, and reinvention. The memory politics of Breslau-Wrocław evolved over decades. During the Cold War, East German and Polish communist governments emphasized the destruction caused by Nazi fanaticism and the liberation provided by Soviet forces. West German exile communities emphasized their loss and suffering, treating Breslau as German territory unjustly occupied. Neither narrative fully captured the complexity. In recent years, with Germany and Poland both members of the European Union and most siege survivors deceased, a more nuanced understanding has emerged. Breslau-Wrocław is recognized as a shared tragedy, a city destroyed by war and ideology, rebuilt by people who deserved better than the choices history gave them. The siege of Breslau demonstrates how war's end can be as terrible as war itself. The final months of World War II in Europe saw some of the war's worst atrocities. The Nazi regime, facing certain defeat, lashed out with increased brutality. The Soviet forces, seeking revenge for years of suffering, showed little mercy. Civilian populations caught between these forces suffered catastrophically. Breslau was one example among many, but its continuation after Germany's surrender makes it particularly emblematic of the senselessness that characterized the war's conclusion. The individuals involved in Breslau's defense and destruction carried their experiences for life. General Niehoff spent 10 years in Soviet captivity and died in Germany in 1966, never fully recovering from the moral burden of his role. Karl Hanke's attempt to escape justice failed. He was recognized while traveling under a false identity, captured and executed in June 1945. His body was never recovered. Dr. Wilhelm Schmidt, the surgeon, continued practicing medicine after the war, but suffered from recurring nightmares about operating on patients without anesthesia. Anna Berger, who survived in her basement, was deported to Germany in 1946 and died in 1968 without ever returning to Breslau. Lieutenant Franz Köhler spent 5 years in Soviet captivity and returned to Germany in 1950, where he struggled with alcoholism and depression until his death in 1973. Peter Neumann, wounded at age 15, survived Soviet captivity and lived until 2008, spending his later years speaking to students about his experiences. These individual fates, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of people, create the full human cost of the siege. Each person who experienced Breslau in 1945 carried that trauma forward. It affected their relationships, their careers, their mental health, their entire lives. The siege did not end on May 6th. It continued in memories and nightmares for decades. Some survivors spoke about their experiences. Many did not, choosing silence over reliving pain. Both choices were understandable. The siege was something that happened to them, not something they chose, and they coped however they could. The physical evidence of the siege continues to emerge. Construction projects in Wrocław occasionally uncover bunkers, tunnels, and mass graves. Archaeological excavations in preparation for new buildings find artifacts from the siege, weapons, personal items, skeletal remains. Each discovery is a reminder that the past is not truly past, that the foundations of the modern city rest on layers of tragedy. Museums and memorials attempt to preserve this history, to ensure that future generations remember what happened. The effectiveness of this effort is unclear. Young people in Wrocław today learn about the siege in school, but it is historical abstraction, not lived experience. The emotional impact fades with time, which is perhaps natural. But the risk is that the lessons fade too. The lessons of Breslau are straightforward, but often ignored. Fortress city strategies don't work. Refusing to evacuate civilians increases their suffering without improving defense. Fighting after a war is lost accomplishes nothing except additional casualties. Following illegal orders does not absolve responsibility. Fanaticism kills. These lessons seem obvious, yet history repeats. Urban sieges continue to occur. Civilians continue to be trapped in combat zones. Defenders continue fighting hopeless battles. The specific circumstances change, but the fundamental patterns persist. Breslau is history, but its lessons remain relevant. The siege of Breslau, the city that refused to surrender, ended not with a heroic last stand, but with an exhausted capitulation 6 days after the war was over. The defiance accomplished nothing. The destruction was total. The casualties were enormous. The suffering was extreme. And it was all avoidable. Had Breslau been evacuated in January, the city would still have been damaged by the war, but tens of thousands of lives would have been saved. Had the garrison surrendered in February when the siege began, the city's destruction would have been minimized. Had the defense ended on May 8th when Germany surrendered, at least the final week's casualties would have been prevented. But none of these choices were made. Instead, ideology and fanaticism dictated that Breslau would be defended to destruction. And so it was. The ruins of Breslau in May 1945 represented the physical manifestation of Nazi ideology's bankruptcy. The regime had promised greatness and delivered catastrophe. It had promised victory and delivered defeat. It had promised protection and delivered destruction. Everything the Nazi state touched turned to ruins. Breslau was simply one more example, one more city destroyed by a regime that destroyed everything. The people who died in Breslau's ruins died for nothing. Their sacrifice achieved nothing. Their suffering meant nothing in any strategic or political sense. They were victims of decisions made by people who valued ideology over human life, who preferred total destruction to admission of failure, who would rather kill their own population than accept reality. And yet, from those ruins, a new city emerged. Wrocław today is vibrant and prosperous. The scars remain, but do not define the city. Life continues. People work, study, raise families, build careers. The city has a future that honors the past without being imprisoned by it. This is perhaps the final lesson of Breslau. Even the most complete destruction is not permanent. Cities can be rebuilt. Lives can be reconstructed. The trauma persists, but it does not have to dominate. The siege of Breslau destroyed a city, but not the human capacity for recovery and renewal. That capacity, demonstrated by survivors who rebuilt their lives and by the Poles who created Wrocław from Breslau's ruins, is the one genuinely hopeful element in an otherwise dark story. The fortress that refused to surrender finally fell silent on May 6, 1945. The guns stopped firing. The dying stopped. And in the silence, survivors emerged from basements and bunkers to see what remained. They found a city that no longer existed, transformed into ruins that would take generations to clear. They found bodies that would never be identified. They found loss that could never be recovered. They found themselves alive in circumstances they had not chosen, facing futures they had not imagined, and somehow they went on. They had to. Giving up was not an option. So they picked through the ruins. They salvaged what could be salvaged. They buried their dead, and they began again. Because that is what humans do. We endure, we survive, we rebuild. Even when everything is destroyed, even when the cost seems unbearable, even when the suffering seems pointless, we continue. The siege of Breslau destroyed a city. It did not destroy the human spirit. And in the end, that makes all the difference.